So hex grids are something that I've never really done on this channel. And if you are someone who wants to design a map for your D&D world or your TTRPG, give it to your players or use it on your computer or use it for planning or measuring distances, hex grids are superior to the standard square grid in a number of ways. It's mainly because of how we measure distance. On a standard grid, you've only got 4 adjacent squares and another 4 diagonally adjacent, but not really touching squares. On a hex grid, you have 6 adjacent hex tiles. Ideally, in terms of how we would measure distance, the best grid would be a circular grid, because then you've got an infinite number of sides and they're all touching one another. But geometrically, you can't have that. But the closest thing you can have to a round grid is a hex grid, which is why it is so useful to measure distances between specific points. When you're creating a hex grid, the best way of doing it is to have one icon or one filling per hex grid. But oftentimes, if you aren't designing a hex grid specifically for a hex grid game or having it as being your only map, having that interface with a standard map isn't going to be the best use of your resources. It means that your distances will be a little bit wonky, because fitting anything onto a grid means that you need to be aware of the realities of having a grid. So in this video, what I'm going to be covering is how to use a hex grid, how to make your map for a campaign based on it, and how to design a hex grid map so that it looks pretty good. And what's more, in this tutorial, I'm going to be using colored pencils. And I know what you're saying, Brian, you never use colored pencils. And it's true. I tend to use paints or watercolors, acrylics, or inks, and pencils only as a last resort because they don't turn up very well on the camera, but also because coloring things with pencils makes me feel like I'm doing a coloring book, which isn't a bad thing. It's just not what I'm here for. But some of my favorite fans, who are between the ages of 6 and 9, have asked me to do colored pencils as a medium, and they are my favorite fans. So I'm going to do that today. Hello adventurers, welcome back to the Red Quills. My name is Ryan, and today we're going to be designing a hex grid map in an isometric style. I'm going to take you through how to use the map, how we can design the iconography, and how a hex grid campaign map can work as a larger view of your landmass. First thing we're going to do is we're going to find a hex grid piece of paper. Now, they aren't very common down here. I will say, if you're watching this from any country other than Australia, I can only speak to my experience, which is that hex grids tend to be something very specific that you can find in gaming stores, but a lot of the time, unless you do a lot of specific shopping around or you order it in, hex grids are difficult to get your hands on. So what I did is I looked up a grid reference online and printed out an A3 page like this. I ended up with a hex grid that was a little bit larger than 1 inch, which is fine, because all I'm doing today is I'm going to show you the mechanics of it, the actual designing of the iconography, and how I would recommend that you use it if you're designing a campaign map. Because we're covering the basics, I don't want too many actual grid hexes. I don't want too many of them, because if it gets too complicated, it's going to be more difficult to wade through the trees and see the forest as a whole, if you know what I mean. When I come back to this, possibly next week, possibly the week after, I will have smaller hexes so that we can kind of talk about a big picture concept. But this is just for the design aspects, this is just for the use of it, and we don't really need to have a broad swathe of hexes for this particular problem. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to design a campaign map for my players. Every kind of map that we create, as we've been covering in the series so far, has to have certain details according to what the purpose of the map is, what's its intention when you're making it. This is a campaign map for the players, which means it needs to have several things. Firstly, it needs to give them a basic understanding of the terrain. That's what they kind of want when they look at a map. They don't necessarily want the information. The information comes later. What they want is this sort of snippet, this on-the-ground view of what it feels like to be in the realm. And when you're creating, a standard map on ungridded paper, then we can do that by using iconography, or we can stylize our mountains and our forests in order to make that feel a specific way. And I talk in other videos about the different mediums that you can use in order to do that, the different styles and the different outcomes that you could have when designing a map so that you can give a different genre, a different feeling for your maps. The second thing that they need is the points of interest. A player's purpose in the world is to move from point A, which is probably, a starting point, to point B, which is going to be where the quest happens. And there should be other points along the way, and there may be point C and point D. But the point of the map, therefore, if I'm giving this to the players, is to isolate and label the specific areas and points of interest that would be of significance to a campaign. So in this particular case, I'm going to go through and going to refer to one of the maps I did earlier in this series. This is my Dungeon Master's map of Shevatai, which is the southern part of the easternmost continent. It has all of the details on it that I need as a Dungeon Master, but it has far too many details and too specific details to give to my players. What I need instead is to just choose a small portion of it, the nation of Orovan, and then I'm going to very broadly sketch out the shape of it, making sure that I know which points that I'm choosing. So I'm going to choose to highlight where the settlements are, where the ruins are, broadly where the roads and rivers and terrain features are, and that's all I need to worry about at this point. And I'm going to come in with the third point that a player or campaign map needs, which is that aesthetic. So the first is making sure that we understand what the land feels like, what it looks like, where the mountains are, what it feels like to stand in the world. The second is the information that's necessary to navigate the world, those points of interest on the road that we're journeying along. The third is the aesthetic of the map itself, something that kind of tells us a little bit more and makes the map, not the world, but the map, interesting and intriguing and memorable. And once we've got those 3 points and we've kind of addressed each one, we have a full campaign map. So, with that in mind, having broadly sketched out where everything is, let's talk about using hexes to design a map. Whenever you design any kind of map, whenever you use any different materials or media or pens or pencils or paints or whatever, you need to be aware of the limitations and, more than that, the preferences of whatever tools you are using. When you're dealing with watercolors, for instance, everything's going to come out and be rather soft. It's very difficult to get hard lines or hard colors when you're using watercolors. When you're dealing with inks, it's the opposite. You can't really do soft, gradual changes from one color to another without a lot of work, or depending on the paper, you can't really soak it in too much liquid or layer things over and over and over again. When you're dealing with a hex grid, the limitation comes from the fact that you're suddenly working in a grid. We're going from infinite possibilities of points to having to narrow things down to being within one grid or another, and thinking about how they border one another, how we're going to present the information, and how that information is shaped by a grid is what we're going to focus on. And so, knowing that we're working with a grid here, the first choice that I'm going to make is to allow the points on the original map to be altered by the grid, which sounds fairly obvious, but the reason that we're doing that is because if I go true to form and I make sure that everything is measured out exactly on this grid map, then it means that I'm not allowing the position of certain points, certain labels, certain rivers, certain roads to follow the aesthetic of the map. What we want is for that third point today, we want this map to be aesthetic and memorable for the players. So in order to do that, we need to lean in to what the hex grid wants us to do, which is follow the lines of the grid. So the coastlines, I'm going to slightly alter so that they follow with the grid. The rivers, when I draw them in later, I'm going to allow them to follow the grid. And I am also going to broadly divide the map into different kinds of terrain, whether that be mountains, hills, rainforests, forests, scrubland or plains, marshlands or deserts. And I'm thinking of it, I'm approaching it as I would any other sort of hex-based terrain game. We might be familiar with Settlers of Catan, or even that game from the Horizon Forbidden West video game, Strike or whatever it's called. I had a couple of physical terrain stacking games in the past where you'd have different colors to represent different terrains. And that's kind of what I'm going for here. But in order to kind of get to that point, before we add in color and use the pencils, we need to have the hard lines and the labels first. So what I'm going to come through and do first is figure out where my mountains and my hills and my coastlines are. Those are the hard lines. Once I've sketched out the broad shape of the continent, that's fairly easy. And as long as I'm remembering that these tiles are specific to one terrain each, then that makes my job a lot easier. If I think that this particular tile only has mountains on it, then that's easy for me to draw out. I can fill the entire hex just with mountains, having noted perhaps that there's a point of interest in a ruin on it, but the point of interest isn't affected by the terrain or vice versa. They sit on top of one another, like a little Monopoly house on its specific square. That means that I don't have to worry about drawing a forest on top of a mountain tile or a river on top of a mountain tile. I can just address where one specific terrain is. And having gone through and made sure that I know where that is, I can look at my map and think, okay, cool. I know where the biggest, most important landmarks are, where the coastline and the mountains and the hills are. Now I'm going to come through using this Dungeon Master's map as a reference. And you don't have to, by the way, you can make this up as you go along. It's just that I'm mapping the same world throughout this series, which means that I kind of have to have a consistency to it. So I'm going to use the previous maps that I done as a reference, but if you're making this up on the spot, then just keep that in mind as to one tile has one kind of terrain. And if you can gradually move from one terrain to another, for instance, you don't necessarily want to have a desert right next to a rainforest or a marshland, because you've got one which is very dry and one which is very wet. Ideally, you want to have some kind of gradual change between them, or some kind of natural barrier between them, like a strait or a river or a mountain. And keeping that in mind, that we've got one terrain per tile, I'm going to come through with a thinner pen now. I'm going to start to design the points of interest. So thinking about this as stacking different assets on top of one another on this hex map. At the bottom, we have the grid itself. The grid helps us to determine where we put tiles of a specific terrain. On top of the tiles, we can assign specific kinds of icons that are determined by the tile themselves, whether that's peaks for a mountain range, whether it's trees for a rainforest, or cactuses for a desert. But on top of that, the most important assets are those points of interest, where the roads are, or the bridges, or the settlements, or the temples or ruins. So I'm going to come through and design those points of interest now, those assets at the top, because they are the important information for a player to be able to find. Once we've got the broad shapes of the continent and the big barriers to movement, then the next most important part is for the players to be able to find out where they're going from one point to another. So the assets are designed then. And I also want to be able to use this map to show much more about what the world feels like. If you've got a village which is known for crossing a river, then it has a large bridge. If you have a significant port city, then it has, docks on the icon. I want the icons to be similar enough that you can see that there's a cohesive thread between them stylistically, but also that it does show what it looks like on the ground. So I'm going to choose this very simple kind of style of house with little windows, and tall towers in the town represents whether or not they have a marketplace. And that's just something for me based on the Dungeon Master's map. In previous maps, we've talked about how you can use symbols and numbering and dotting systems to show the information. I'm going to use a much more subtle system for this map, and I will probably discuss it on the next hex map tutorial that I do, as to how we can hide information in plain sight using these icons, so that the players are unaware of the details that we can pick up just by looking at the map. So the example here is that any town with one of these towers has a marketplace in it where you can get imported goods. Now, speaking of allowing the hex to show us what we're doing on the map itself stylistically and geographically, I am going to have the rivers follow the lines of the hex grid so that they're never within the actual tile itself. You don't have a river that crosses a tile. They always skirt the outsides of a tile, which looks tidy and nice and make sure it stays out of the way. That's the point of using a grid, so that you can see the barriers between them and you know roughly what the distance is. Yes, it does require a little bit of willing suspension of disbelief, because of course you don't really often get hexagonal rivers in nature, but it does mean that the map looks more tidy and that it follows a consistent aesthetic. Along with that consistent aesthetic, with the rivers following the outside of the tiles, we'll also have the titles and the labels following the direction of the hexagons. So from the point of the icon that it's labeling, I'll choose the nearest hexagonal border and I will follow the direction of that border and write to the labels, which lends itself to this very sort of picturesque view of what a map will look like as I add in more and more and I do more iconography. And then I come in with a second thinner pen in order to show, you know, where the trees are, where the grass is, and really kind of flesh out the icons for the terrain. Then it begins to show that the hex has given us a very strong aesthetic in and of itself, that having those labels follow the borders of the hexes, having the rivers follow the hexes, having the terrain stay within its specific tile, having and using those consistently means that it follows that we have this rule for where we place given points, that the ideal point for an asset is on one of the corners of a hex tile, so that the title can more easily follow the line of the hex, or if it's on a river, that town or that icon can be shown to be right next to a river, as many towns and villages and cities often are. And we're going to, as we do this and come through and add in more icons and do little trees and bushes and grasslands and flesh out how the vegetation looks and the coastlines look, I am going to completely ignore the hex for the roads. And the reason for that is simple, because you need at least one part of the map to be eye-catching and to draw your attention. In this particular case, we're going for a really picturesque aesthetic. When I come in with the colors, it's going to look like a picture, like a drawing, like a cartoon even. And because of that, I'm not going to have these labels in, you know, bright red. Or if this were the Dungeon Masters map that I was working with, the colors are eye-catching and represent different, you know, political factions. In this case, what I want to be eye-catching are the roads, the lines between specific points, because that's what I want the players to be looking at. How all of these separate points on this network are connected to one another. And in order to make them different, those roads, different from everything else on the map, is that they don't follow the hexes. And you can do this with anything. You could do it with ley lines. You could do it with labels that are particularly important. Just ignore the grid altogether. Whatever your most significant detail is, the thing that you want to draw attention to more than anything else should be the exception to the rule. So we've come through and we did like the broad strokes of the coastline and the mountains. And that, more than anything, is for us as map makers to know how to triangulate different points. We use those to show us where on the map specific things are. Then we come in and we start doing the actual layers. The first layer is the assets. Towns and cities and villages, you know, rivers and points of interest, ruins and temples and whatnot. Then we come in with the terrain, which is the flavor on top of a tile, whether that's, you know, reeds for a marshland, whether it's trees for a jungle, or cacti and rocks for a desert. And then we're coming in for the third layer, which is going to be the color layer, which is going to really kind of bring this aesthetic home. Again, I'm going for this sort of tiled feeling, Settlers of Catan sort of vibe. And so what that means is every tile is going to have a base color. Let's use the deserts as an example, shall we? I'm going to come in with a base orange layer. I'm going to go quite light. And once I've filled out the whole tile with a light orange layer, I'm going to come through, I'm going to give it a little bit of mottling so it looks a bit more interesting. A few areas of this sort of darker reddish orange as well, just to model it up a little bit. You would be surprised what the eye can pick up. I know it's not particularly strong on the camera that I'm using to film the map making, but always when it comes to pencils, always go lighter than you think you need. Take your time and layer it up slowly. If you come in too quickly, you're going to start to create furrows in the paper. It's going to be much more difficult to get even shading. So long, light strokes and adding those layers over time is the best way to add color or blend color. Then I'm going to come through with the other colors, and I'm going to add in the color for the roads and the colors for the cacti and the colors for the rivers and the roofs on the houses. And that's going to give us a strong aesthetic for this particular tile. Once I've done that kind of tile, I'm going to come in with another kind of tile. Let's do the marshlands. And again, I'm going to go do that base layer. Single block color, I'm going to mottle it a little bit, and then I'm going to color in the assets on top of it. Darker green for the reeds, and then grays and browns and dark greens for the icons, the assets on top of that. And that's how we're going to go through, and we're going to do all of the different biomes on this map. And then when we're done, we end up with a map that looks very aesthetic, but is really, really simple to pull off. If you've got a bit of patience, you've got 3 different thicknesses of pens. It's not a very difficult hurdle to get your hands on 3 different kinds of fine liner pens, like the ones in the description here, and then come in with some pencils. It should be noted that I just used whatever color pencils I could get my hands on, and they were just, I found them in a box. They are actually watercolor pencils, which I only kind of found out halfway through because they're so old that the label has actually rubbed off most of these pencils. But that being said, if I'd used actual, coloring pencils, it probably would have worked out better for me, because this paper isn't conducive to watercolors. Anyway, I've added in the title. I've added in a hexagonal compass. Again, it's a nice touch. Why not? It's going to be fun. And I've given a scale as well. And then that map follows all of these kinds of rules that we've added that are only guidelines given to us by the grid itself. How we position those points, how we color things, how we differentiate between the tiles, where we position our rivers or our assets, and how we're showing the coastline and the rivers following the grid. All of these things aren't arbitrary decisions that I've made. They are taken from the material that we are using. Whenever you make a map, whenever you ask yourself, how I can make this more aesthetic, always first look at the materials that you are using, because they will have their own sort of stylistic preferences. Look up how other pencil artworks have been made. Or if you're using a grid, ask yourself, how can I most efficiently show the information? What does the grid want me to do? What does the paper want me to do? What does the pencil or the ink want me to do? Soft colors for pencils are much, much easier than hard, strong lines, unless you're working with graphite. Inks like high contrast and hard lines. A grid like this likes straight lines. It abhors wiggling curves or jagged edges. Watercolor paper is much more absorbent, and it likes you to layer things over time, but paper like this means that you can't use wet ingredients. Always ask yourself what material you are working with for the best practice of making your map. Now, I've talked rather a lot in this video about making a hex map, and the real lesson that I want to bring us all back to is those 3 layers in this map. In order to make it look aesthetic, all you need to do is break it down into layers and ask yourself what you need to do on each of them. We're showing the information a specific way. We're showing what the landscape looks like. We're showing where the points of interest are, and we're giving the map an aesthetic. Underneath that, we're showing where the assets are. And then underneath the assets, we're showing what the terrain is like. And underneath that, we're showing how the landscape is divided into hexagons. 3 layers for making the map, 3 layers for the information on the map. That's all you need to memorize, and then you are good to go. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, but I will come back to hex maps. What I want you to do is ask me specific questions that you have from this episode so that I can address them in the next hex map episode, okay? Stick it in the comments below and I'll come back to it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next week for our next Game Master map. See you then. Like this. And I ended up, where's my pencils? You guys are the worst, you know that? Oh, there you go. So I ended up with a